On the evening of October 3rd, 1993, Jamie Smith, a 21-year-old corporal with the 3rd Battalion of the 75th Ranger Regiment, was fighting his way towards a downed helicopter deep inside the African city of Mogadishu. Like everyone on his team, he was trying to rescue the pilot and crew of a helicopter that had been shot down by a rocket-propelled grenade. He and his teammates made their way to the crash site, the dark of the night interrupted by muzzle flashes as bullets zipped around them. Smith returned fire as best he could before being struck in the leg and falling to the ground. His friends pulled him to safety, where a medic discovered that his femoral artery had been severed and they would have to clamp it shut to stop the bleeding if Smith was to survive. This was an injury that could have been easily fixed with the right tools. Tools the medic just didn't have, and despite this, the medic tried everything to help him, but was unable to stop the bleeding. He called for a helicopter to evacuate Smith to the field hospital, but his request was denied for fear that another helicopter would be shot down. Jamie Smith bled to death in the arms of his friend from an injury that should have been fixable. His death and the death of 18 other soldiers would serve as the catalyst for a decade-long search for the first breakthrough in traumatic bleeding control in over 2,000 years to ensure that no soldier needlessly died this way ever again. 9 years later, in 2002, with a budget in excess of $80 billion, the United States Army would fight against adopting a brand new technological innovation. It wasn't a $50 million Apache helicopter, it wasn't a $6 million tank or a $2,000 rifle. It was this: a $9 bandage and the medical miracle that could have saved Jamie Smith's life. Hello everyone, today we are looking at the story of Quikclot, the first major breakthrough in traumatic bleeding control since the Roman Empire, and how the United States Army refused to use it, leading to the unnecessary deaths of several soldiers and one of the largest medical lawsuits in military history. It's a story of unchecked egos, small business versus the military-industrial complex and big pharma. It's a story about war, about daring medical practices and saving lives, and above all, it's a story about blood. Before we get into it, I want to encourage anyone watching to find a CPR and a civilian trauma care training course near them and go take it. Emergencies happen every day, and you never know when an opportunity to save a life might present itself, and the best that you can do is be prepared. I will link below to several sites that can help you find a course near you if you are interested, and with that, we're going to get into it, and thank you for watching. It is a well-accepted fact in trauma care that all bleeding stops eventually, either because it is treated or there's no more blood to come out of you and you're dead. Not ideal. This leaves trauma medics with only two options: stop the bleeding at the source, or keep putting blood into the patient until you can get them to a place that can stop it. And if you've ever been in a doctor's office or donated blood, you've likely noticed that blood has to be kept cold after it leaves the body in order to still be useful. This fact alone makes it basically impossible for military medics on the front line to continually give blood to patients that are in desperate need of it, leaving one option: stop the bleeding. And that is what military personnel have been trying to do since humans started fighting each other like forever ago. Cloth and animal skin bandages have been found on battlefields reaching back to ancient Rome, Sparta, and even Egypt. And everyone knows one of the most soul-crushing scenes in any war movie is watching a medic try and stop bleeding by stuffing gauze into a wound, telling his friend to hold pressure on it and that he's going to be okay, even though we as an audience know that's a lie. All of this to say, in the thousands of years that separate the 300 Spartans and the global war on terror, military technology has advanced to a degree that is almost unrecognizable. Airplanes, helicopters, night vision goggles, rockets, missiles, and nuclear bombs, all advancements designed to kill the enemy with greater efficiency. And yet, the medics that treat wounds caused by these weapons still carry the same thing they did thousands of years ago: strips of gauze and something to numb the pain. But in the 1980s, and unbeknownst to anyone, a mechanical engineer from Connecticut was about to discover the most radical change in traumatic medicine in over 2,000 years. Meet Frank Hersey, owner and CEO of On-Site Gas Systems, a company that produces oxygen enrichment machines for hospitals. When he isn't obsessing over the mechanics of his machines, he spends time volunteering at his church and taking his kids to school and sporting events, just like a regular guy living his life. So, how does a guy like that discover a medical miracle for war? Well, the machines that Frank builds use a mineral called zeolite to remove impurities in oxygen, and Frank, after working with the mineral for several years, well, he has an idea. What if zeolite could absorb the water in blood and stop bleeding from cuts? One day in 1983, he decides to test this theory on a mouse that he buys from a pet store. Against the wishes of his wife, Frank gives the mouse a small cut with a razor and blood starts to pour out. He takes a small pinch of ground up zeolite and pours it into the wound and waits. Almost immediately, the blood starts to thicken and then stops entirely. He bandages up the mouse and releases it into his backyard. Excited that his experiment worked, Frank filed for a patent in 1984, trying to sell this idea as a cure for razor cuts from shaving. However, he's not able to get a product off the ground, and he eventually shelves the idea, never knowing that he had just made the greatest breakthrough in traumatic medicine since before the birth of Christ. And his discovery would go unused, unneeded, and forgotten until an incident in 1993 would bring the need for his discovery to the world stage. All right, here's the situation. This is Somalia. No, not that one. Yeah, that one. That's it. It's got lovely sandy beaches, beautiful weather, and a famine that threatens to starve a lot of people to death. But have no fear, the UN is here, trying to get food and medicine to those in need. Unfortunately, this famine is like all others in history and quickly plunges the country into a bloody civil war. In reaction to this, the UN tries to pivot from famine relief to installing a central government, and if you know anything about the UN, you know that this isn't gonna go well. UN forces try to keep the peace in the country, but on June 5th, 1993, a large number of UN forces from Pakistan were killed by men under the leader of Muhammad Adid, who, for all intents and purposes, is basically a gang leader or a cartel boss. And we all know how Uncle Sam feels about cartels. UN forces, with help from the United States, retaliated in July with a series of air raids that killed many of Adid's top advisors. And this made his followers realize that this was not a cause they wanted to be a part of, and his support died out, allowing the UN to install a new government and establish peace. Nah, I'm just kidding. His support soared to the point that him and his gang took control of the entire city of Mogadishu and started targeting US and UN forces directly. This led to then President Bill Clinton to order Operation Gothic Serpent in order to capture Adid. On the afternoon of October 3rd, US and UN forces left the Mogadishu airport in Little Bird and Black Hawk helicopters en route to capture two of Adid's top lieutenants deep inside the city. While en route, one of the Black Hawk helicopters suddenly plummets out of the sky and crashes in the streets below after being hit by an RPG. The crash kills both pilots instantly and leaves the other crew members badly wounded. Leadership immediately starts working on finding out exactly what is going on and coordinating a rescue when suddenly a second Black Hawk is shot down. What was supposed to be a quick snatch and grab suddenly devolves into a frenzied defense of downed helicopters in enemy-held territory while leadership and rescue forces scramble to retrieve the injured men. After a full day and night of fighting, survivors and equipment are recovered, but at the cost of 18 Americans killed, one of which was Jamie Smith, and 84 wounded. The deadliest battle involving US forces since Vietnam. It is while this battle is raging in the streets of the city that a man by the name of John Holcomb is sitting at an army field hospital, listening to the sounds of rockets and gunfire in the distance, and waiting. What was he waiting for? Wounded soldiers. He knew that if he was hearing gunfire and rockets, it meant that something went wrong, and soon young Americans would be brought into his tent, likely bleeding and screaming. This was nothing new to John Holcomb. At this point, he had been working in Army medicine since 1985, deployed as a surgeon with Joint Special Operations Command to some of the most remote places on Earth. He had seen what battle does to the human body, but what he was about to witness would change the trajectory of his entire life. At 5:30 p.m., the first casualties arrive, and they keep coming, and Holcomb spent the next 36 hours in surgery after surgery. One of the soldiers he operated on had a severed artery after his leg was ripped off by an RPG explosion. Over the course of the surgery, this soldier was given 46 pints of blood. For reference, the human body only holds about 8 to 12 pints of blood, meaning that this soldier was bleeding so profusely that he essentially emptied his body of blood 4 times over. At one point, Holcomb is so desperate for blood that he starts drawing it from uninjured soldiers and putting it directly into injured men. Dozens and dozens of soldiers are brought into his tent, bleeding and screaming in pain, surrounded by some of the best medical equipment in the world, and yet many of them bled to death in Holcomb's arms because he was trying to stop the bleeding the same way surgeons did in the Civil War. Strips of gauze and pressure. Holcomb leaves that hospital a changed man, and from this moment on, he is dedicated to finding a better solution to the problem of traumatic bleeding control. And several years after Mogadishu, he becomes the director of Army Trauma Medicine, a position he holds when America is plunged into the global war on terror following the attacks on 9/11. While in this position, he often encourages implementing risky or unproven techniques, anything to ensure that no other soldier bleeds to death in his arms ever again. The problem of soldiers bleeding to death is now on the forefront of everyone in military medicine's mind, and John Holcomb is single-mindedly trying to solve this problem. The only question is, how do we solve it? Well, there's a bit of a problem with that, and it comes down to how trauma is treated. Trauma care is a special kind of medical care because unlike every other time someone goes to the doctor or schedules a procedure, a trauma patient is often not awake or coherent enough to consent to treatment, meaning that the only things doctors can do are the things they're approved to do, even if a possibly better yet unproven solution is right there in front of him. This is part of what makes advancements in trauma so slow. Those treating it often have their hands tied by regulations that can keep them from being creative in solving the problem. Holcomb decided that he and his team of army doctors are going to tackle trauma aggressively and were armed with Holcomb's own definition of the ideal trauma doctor: steady hands, a stout heart, and not too much philosophy. Holcomb believed that in order for the army to solve this problem, he needs doctors that are willing to push the boundaries of medicine and even go against the established rules if they have to. They can't just sit around and wait for every clinical trial and board of doctors to approve techniques. Tons of soldiers are now headed to war after 9/11, and they aren't going to care what some doctor thinks whether a treatment is a good idea or not. They're going to want whatever helps them survive, and Holcomb wants to give that to them. This is the mindset of Holcomb and his crew of army doctors, and they decide that they're going to use biology to stop bleeding.
Yes, science!
To understand how they are going to try and do this, we first have to understand how blood clotting works. Remember when you were a kid and you fell and scraped your knee, how bad it stung and bled at first? But then after just a few minutes, the blood that was coming out stopped completely, and pretty soon you had a scab. Well, from the outside, it looks like a miracle, but in fact, this is a process that our bodies do all the time and are really good at. When you injure yourself, a break in the wall of a blood vessel signals your body to start what is known as the coagulation cascade. This is a release of a complex system of what is called clotting factors that have to be activated in a certain order for blood to actually clot. These factors work together with these things called platelets to start sealing the wound and create what is known as fibrin. Fibrin is basically a series of cables that help hold all the platelets and other blood cells together to create the clot. Think of it like a beaver building a dam. There's large sticks, small sticks, and mud that all have to fit together in order to stop the water. It's the same thing with blood. A clot is just a bunch of blood stuck together and kept from flowing out of the body. So that is obviously a complicated system where everything has to go just right. Unfortunately, no matter how effective it is, it's extremely slow even on minor cuts and fatally slow on major injuries like those sustained on the battlefield. So Holcomb and his team go to work testing multiple techniques of speeding up this process. One technique involves a bandage made out of fibrin to basically have a pre-built clot, but it doesn't really work. The best solution they find was a company called Hemcon, who uses a bandage packaged with a chemical called chitosan that is derived from shrimp shells. Chitosan helps blood clot by basically working like a magnet for platelets, pulling them through the bloodstream and to the clot faster. After testing the prototypes on pigs with some relative success at stopping bleeding, Holcomb and the rest of Army medicine quickly advocate for the bandage, pouring tens of millions of dollars into the bandage with the hope that they had finally solved the problem of traumatic bleeding once and for all. Little did they know that a more effective solution had already been discovered, but Holcomb, the Army, and the entire world would soon find out. While John Holcomb and Army medicine were scrambling to solve the problem of traumatic bleeding, Frank Hersey was running his oxygen machine company, having already solved their problem nearly 2 decades earlier. And when I say running his company, that's a bit of a stretch. For nearly 20 years, he'd seen almost no growth and oftentimes struggled to pay his rent on his building. This was due in part to the fact that Frank is just not a good salesman. He goes full autism mode in explaining the complex engineering of his machines rather than what they actually do for the customer. Think of it like a car salesman trying to sell an SUV to a soccer mom by explaining how the fuel injectors work, when all she really wants to know is if it has enough seats for her kids and if her Stanley Cup can fit in the cup holder. It's not an effective strategy, and his company is struggling because of it. But it doesn't really seem to bother Frank that much. As long as he's able to tism over engineering, spend time with his wife, and donate money to his church, he doesn't really mind selling few of his machines. This would all change, however, when he hires Bart Gulong as his head salesman. Bart is a down-on-his-luck salesman who has spent the last several years floating between all sorts of odd jobs, from used yacht salesman to nightclub promoter. But he's never really satisfied with any of these jobs because it feels meaningless to him. He wants to sell products that actually have a positive impact on the world, and at the time he meets Frank, he is unemployed, and he's struggling to think that he will ever make a difference in the world. One day, almost randomly, he sees an ad in the paper with a company called On-Site Gas Systems, and he arranges a meeting. After meeting Frank and touring the factory, Bart believes that Frank is an absolute genius when it comes to building machines. He's just a terrible salesman. This is hammered home to Bart by a meeting that the two of them have with a prospective buyer, and about 15 minutes in, Frank gets up from the table and starts tinkering with the coffee machine in the room. Bart tells Frank that he desperately needs someone to take over selling the machines, and that's exactly what Bart does, growing the company faster and selling more machines than it ever has before. And this partnership between Bart and Frank is a huge factor in what happens next. You see, Frank is the engineering genius of the two, but he doesn't really have the drive or knack for selling his ideas. He's pretty happy to just continue working on his machines and selling them whenever he can. This is why when he couldn't get a company to buy his idea of using zeolite on shaving cuts, he just shelved the idea and went back to what he was doing. But Bart's different. He wants to take advantage of opportunities or force himself into them if he has to. If he has a product that he knows works, he's going to convince you to buy it. And in the wake of 9/11, Bart knew that the military would need Frank's oxygen machines, and he was right, securing a military contract producing them for mobile surgical centers, something Frank never would have pursued and actually pushed back on when Bart first brought it up. But Bart, ever the salesman, is able to convince Frank that not only is this a good business opportunity, but it gives them the chance to save lives, something Frank is definitely on board with, so he agrees, and they eventually put in for the contract. Really quickly, there's something you need to know about military contracts. Most people think that military contracts are just the military going around writing checks and throwing taxpayer money at these huge companies whenever they want. But that's not really how it works. There is a ton of testing and selection that has to be done first. In the case of these mobile surgery centers, a spec sheet was sent out to the companies about what size the machine could be, how much it could weigh, and how much oxygen it needed to produce. And in all cases, the projects that the military wants designs for and the companies involved are assigned liaisons, military members that oversee the production and testing process of the new equipment. Think Rhodey from the first Iron Man, a sort of middleman between the military and these companies. Well, Barton Frank's Rhodey is a Marine medic and one of the most experienced combat medics in the military at this time, Tom Eagles. Eagles first entered the military as a Navy corpsman during the Vietnam War, where he flew 221 combat missions. He was shot multiple times and received multiple Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars. By the time Frank and Bart meet him, he's a bit of a grizzly man who walks with a limp and spends his days working as a liaison with the Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory, trying to acquire medical technology to save who he refers to as the kid in the ditch. This was his way of saying that he wants technology and products that can save the scared, wounded young soldiers left to die in the battlefield. He doesn't care about those in positions of leadership, and as often as he said the phrase, the kid in the ditch, he also says, the f***ing brass, referring to leadership causing him problems. He's just the spitting image of every grizzled Marine who can't stand bureaucracy but is so good at his job that he has to deal with it constantly. And Eagles is in charge of finding the company to build the oxygen machines for the mobile surgical centers, and is shocked when he arrives at Frank and Bart's and they actually have a functioning prototype when all the other companies just submitted drawings. This impresses Eagles, and they eventually win the deal for producing the machines, giving them a soft introduction to the world of military contracts. And while working with Eagles on developing the oxygen generators, Bart mentions Frank's discovery with zeolite, and Eagles characteristically shuts him down, telling him not to chase another contract like all the other defense companies trying to get on Uncle Sam's gravy train. Bart assures Eagles that they aren't in it to just make money, they want to save the kid in the ditch, just like Eagles does. As luck would have it, that conversation with Eagles would be a turning point for Bart and Frank, because a few weeks later, Eagles calls and tells them that he got them a spot in a blood clotting trial being put on by the Office of Naval Research. At the last minute, one of the companies that was challenging Holcomb and his team for a trauma bandage dropped out, and Eagles, who isn't really a fan of Army medicine or John Holcomb, was able to give the spot to Bart and Frank. The trial was based off of the wound that was sustained by Jamie Smith, and now shown in full bloody detail to the world in the recently released film Black Hawk Down, based on the events of the Battle of Mogadishu. Meaning not only did the military want a solution, now the public wanted it too. For the trial, a group of pigs were to be sedated and cut at the femoral artery, just like Jamie Smith. The bandages would then be applied to the injury following their use directions, and then they would wait and see. If the pigs lived, it was a pass, and if they died, it was a fail. Bart personally delivers the zeolite in a vacuum-sealed bag and even filmed a couple of the tests, something he wasn't supposed to do, and he saw most of the pigs, at least at first, survived the test. He would have to wait the final results of all the tests, but he was confident that they had the best product. After returning home, he eventually receives a call from the doctor who administered the trial and is told that not only was their product the best performer out of any of the others, including John Holcomb's Hemcon bandage, but Frank and Bart had the only product where none of the pigs died. This meant that maybe the world was finally catching up to what Frank Hersey had known for nearly 20 years, and to him, this test is all the validation he needs. To Bart, it's the business opportunity of a lifetime. He had stumbled upon the genius of Frank Hersey almost by accident, and now he is finally going to have a product that is worth selling and that will save lives too. Maybe this is his chance to make a difference. Shortly after the trial, Bart has a conference call with Eagles and a man named Joe DeCorda, the Navy equivalent to John Holcomb. DeCorda and Eagles inform Bart that they will need to seek FDA approval for the product to continue pushing it to the military, and it could potentially take years, even decades. Bart can't believe it. Despite all the momentum of their work, the United States thrust into the global war on terror, and soldiers dying from bleeding out left and right, they are still going to have to spend years in clinical trials. His dream is seemingly going to be dashed before it ever really even gets off the ground. Luckily, Eagles is on the team, and he suggests that he could probably get a letter from his superiors in the warfighting lab stating that this product is mission critical, and that it could also be considered a medical device rather than a drug, which could also fast-track its acceptance. I don't have any way to verify this, but I like to imagine Bart trying to kiss Eagles through the phone like in the old cartoons. Excited about this prospect, Bart rushes to Frank and they start working on a name for the product and the new company they are going to have to start in order to produce it. They look around at all the medical companies that already exist and they saw a pattern. Many of them had a Z somewhere in the name. This gave these companies an air of precision and finality, thanks to Z being the final letter in the alphabet, and also gave a sense of exactness with the sharp lines. With this strategy in mind, they settled on Z Medica for their new company. And next was the product name. They needed something that told the user what the product did and how it did it. Obviously, it was a clotting product, and a big selling point was how fast it was. After shuffling around some of the words, Bart comes up with Quikclot, even removing the K to hammer home how fast it worked. Pretty savvy marketing, if you ask me. So they have their company name and their product line. Now they just need to grab the old paperwork from Frank's Records and submit their FDA application. So they grab the paperwork. The patent expired.
God damn it! Gosh darn it! Shit! Shoot!
All this work is about to be for nothing because Frank let the patent expire, and even worse, someone else swooped in and submitted their own patent. Thankfully, Bart is a savvy salesman and is able to convince the holder of the patent to allow Bart and Frank to continue their work without infringing on the patent. Armed with a patent letter and a letter from Eagles that Quikclot would be mission critical, they fast-track their FDA approval and start shipping Quikclot out to Navy corpsmen in their medical bags, meaning that Quikclot is now headed to war and Bart and Frank have to do what everyone else in the country is doing. Sit and wait to see what happens and if Quikclot is going to be more than just a success in the lab. And while all this is going on with Frank and Bart, John Holcomb and his team of army doctors have selected the Hemcon shrimp shell bandage as the battle dressing of choice for the army, even though the trials showed that the Hemcon bandage was about as effective as regular gauze at stopping bleeding. But who knows? Maybe the opposite will be true in the field, and the Hemcon bandage will outperform Quikclot at stopping bleeding when they are tested in combat. Only time will tell. In February 2003, Lieutenant Commander Tim Coakley is riding shotgun in a Humvee driving through the Iraq desert headed to Baghdad as part of a cargo convoy. While en route, the Humvee radio suddenly sparks to life and a message comes through that a Marine has been shot in the neck about half a mile ahead. Coakley and his driver make their way forward where they find a Marine, a 19-year-old private with blonde hair and blue eyes, writhing on the ground in pain with blood spurting from his neck and coating his uniform. Crouched over the Marine is a medic that is hyperventilating and shouting, "Oh my God," over and over again. You know, the exact reaction to blood you want from a medic. Coakley moves the useless medic out of the way and starts working on the Marine, pressing gauze into the holes of his neck and reassuring him that he's going to be okay. Although the bullet had missed his carotid artery, the Marine is losing a lot of blood and the gauze just isn't slowing it down. The screaming medic had already called for an ambulance, but that could take 20 to 30 minutes, and by that time, this Marine is almost certainly going to be dead. So Coakley rummages through his aid bag looking for something, anything to help this kid, and he finds a package of Quikclot. Although he doesn't have any experience with it, he does remember a training he had before going on deployment that showed him how to use it, and it seems as good at any time to give it a shot. After quickly reading the directions, Coakley rips the packet open and pours the granules into the Marine's wound and packs it with more gauze. After a few seconds, the bleeding starts slowing down, and then after a minute, stops. He wraps the wound in gauze, loads the Marine into the ambulance once it arrives, and sends him on his way, hoping he will survive. But Coakley had worked as a medic long enough to know that there was no guarantee. From what he sees with this Marine, Coakley starts using Quikclot a ton, using it more and more on wounded soldiers and Marines, and even on a native man who had his entire back ripped open by the overpressure of an IED. Coakley's not the only one. There are many others in the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force who see the effectiveness of Quikclot on the battlefield firsthand, and their stories soon help increase Quikclot's reputation as the next advancement in traumatic bleeding control. And after 5 more months in Iraq, and even being blown out of a Humvee in an IED blast himself, Coakley is eventually shipped back to the United States. When he gets back to base, he's required to turn in his gear, so he's walking over to where he's supposed to drop it off, not really paying attention to things around him. He's got other things on his mind, his family, and what he's gonna do now that he's home, when suddenly the raspy voice of the Marine taking his gear catches his attention, and he looks up and sees this Marine has blonde hair, blue eyes, and a scar on his neck. After a moment, the Marine recognizes him and he starts to tear up and says, You're the one who said I would be okay after I got shot. Thank you." And completely taken off guard by seeing this Marine he saved, Coakley just responds, "Thank you." He then finishes turning in his gear and walks to a liquor store. Little does he know that this story of saving this Marine's life is going to drastically change the trajectory of his own, and that his personal battle was just beginning. After returning home, Coakley tries to return to work as a physician, but it just isn't working. He's lost his ability to be an effective doctor, something that is hammered home to him when he takes 5 hours to apply stitches to a dog bite victim, something that should have taken him less than an hour. It's at this point that Coakley discovers that he is suffering from pretty severe PTSD and takes a break from practicing medicine on the floor, citing to his superiors that he will be the most dangerous doctor in the hospital if he keeps working. During his break, he decides that he wants to look into what makes Quikclot so effective, so with permission from his superiors, he starts doing lab work on the product, and this is when he is introduced to Joseph DeCorda. DeCorda tells Coakley that him and Eagles are looking for medics with experience using Quikclot in combat to come and give their testimony at the military trade shows where Quikclot is being presented alongside HemCon and other medical inventions. Think of these like giant middle school science fairs, only instead of gold stars from your teacher, you win millions of dollars from the Department of War. Coakley agrees and goes to his first medical conference in St. Petersburg, Florida, where he meets up with DeCorda and briefly meets Bart, who thanks him for being there to share his stories. As Coakley makes his way into the conference room, he notices there's a large number of guests refusing to sit down, instead standing against the back wall, and they all look really pissed off. That seems kind of weird to him, but he's here to give a speech, so he makes his way to the stage. He begins his speech by telling the story of the young Marine that was shot in the neck and how amazed he was at how fast Quikclot stopped the bleeding. He then told the story of the person whose back had been ripped open by the IED. While he was telling these stories, the group standing in the back started shouting questions like, "How do you know it worked?" and "Are you suggesting that the Army drop HemCon and switch to Quikclot, which will require a ton of training?" Coakley does his best to respond to these questions, telling about how it required almost no training and how he had read the instructions right before using it. And yeah, I'm pretty sure it worked. I literally turned my gear in at the end of my deployment to a kid I used it on. None of that really mattered though, because as soon as he ends his speech and walks off stage, he is surrounded by this group of army doctors and representatives from HemCon telling him he doesn't know what he's talking about and that they aren't going to listen to him because he's not from the army. And that last jab about him not being from the army, them's fighting words. This sends Coakley into his own rage, telling them, "You're damn right I'm not from the army. I'm a Navy doctor who's seen this stuff work in the field. Tell me, when's the last time any of you were in combat?" Eventually, DeCorda steps in and keeps Coakley from turning this conference into a bar fight, and he pulls him into the lobby of the hotel.
Before we get started, does anyone want to get out?
There he sees a tall, distinguished-looking man with graying hair standing quietly and watching this whole thing. When Coakley goes to introduce himself and shake the man's hand, the guy just walks away. Another man walks up in his place, hands Coakley a business card, and tells him that he has no idea who he's dealing with, and that he just stepped into the big leagues, and if he ever runs into any trouble, to give him a call. Turns out that this man was one of the senior medical officials for the Department of Defense working at the Pentagon. Coakley puts the card in his pocket and walks with DeCorda to the beach. There, DeCorda explains that the man who spurned Coakley's handshake was none other than John Holcomb. And this wouldn't be the first time that Holcomb and his doctors would spurn Coakley or Quikclot at these trade shows. It became a common pattern for Coakley to be doing research on Quikclot at home, go to a medical conference, and be bombarded by the same questions from army doctors and the same expressions from Holcomb. But why? Why do Holcomb and his band of army doctors hate Quikclot so much? Shouldn't they be celebrating the fact that there is a product out there that can save soldiers' lives and stop bleeding? Well, it goes a bit deeper than just the battle between HemCon and Quikclot, down to the separation of the branches of the military and long-standing attitudes within the army. You see, there is a level of pride that exists in the army as the oldest and largest of the branches in the military. One of the things that this pride and size does is gives the army a lot of sway within the Department of War and the public eye. Meaning that if the army adopts something, it can quickly spread to other branches and even into the civilian world as well. It also means that the army is very stubborn when it comes to adopting ideas or technology that they didn't come up with. One of the greatest examples of this was the adoption of the M16 during the Vietnam War. Basically, the United States military was looking to replace the heavy wooden rifles from the World War II and Korean era with lighter weapons that could carry more ammunition. Eugene Stoner, a small weapons manufacturer and designer, came up with the AR-15 design and submitted it for a military trial, and it did awesome. This pissed off the army because they weren't the ones that had invented it. This led the army to conducting studies that only published the negative results and even used ammunition that wasn't recommended by the manufacturer. This led to design changes being made that led to the weapon being unreliable and often dangerous for soldiers to operate, and even led to many soldiers being killed or injured due to ineffective weapons. And there was even pushback from the army with regard to using planes because the Wright brothers were outside of the army, and the army couldn't admit that someone other than themselves had solved a problem. These long-standing attitudes are what Coakley and the rest of the Quikclot team are now up against, and Coakley is about to learn how deep the roots of this go. One day, while Coakley is working on his research into Quikclot's effectiveness, he gets a tip from a public affairs officer to write a letter to the congressman in Virginia asking for more funding for his research, and the officer even helps Coakley write the letter and send it off. Several weeks later, after Coakley had given several television interviews about using Quikclot in the field, he receives a phone call from a captain in his chain of command telling him that he is now under an investigation for court-martial. The captain tells Coakley that soliciting military funds directly from a member of Congress is illegal and that a preliminary hearing is scheduled for a few days. The captain also asks Coakley if he received permission for the rest of his research from the proper channels, and Coakley says yes and goes to get the emails giving him permission from his computer, only to discover that his entire server has been wiped. At this point, Coakley's pretty sure he was set up by the public affairs officer and others within the military in order to silence him from speaking about his experience with Quikclot, and that John Holcomb and his band of army doctors may have something to do with it. Luckily for him, Coakley is close with the IT department at his hospital, and they restore his emails, which he prints out and sticks in a binder, which is good because the next day he goes to check his emails again and finds that once again they've been deleted. Alright, there's something shady going on. Coakley's done messing around, and he calls that Pentagon official who'd given him his card at the hotel in Florida, and Coakley explains the situation over lunch, and the official tells him he would see what he could do to help. Once Coakley arrives at the hearing several days later, he shows everyone present the emails showing that he had followed all the correct procedures in his research and told them he didn't know soliciting funds this way was illegal. He is then asked to step out of the room while the others discuss that matter, and while outside, he can hear somebody screaming that they want Coakley kicked out of the Navy. After some further discussion, Coakley is brought back into the room and told that they are not going any further with the investigation. He would find out later that while he was out of the room, the others discussed the upcoming 2004 election, and that because Coakley had been speaking publicly about his experiences in Iraq, they didn't want him going rogue and bashing the military if they fired him. Looks like the bureaucracy that had tried to fire him may have also saved his job. Politics. And all of this, the pushback at the conferences and the attempted court-martial was well known to Bart and Frank, who finally learned why the army was pushing so hard against Quikclot, or at least the reason that the army gave. That Quikclot burns. Up to this point, a lot of studies were being done on Quikclot, and there was a huge debate over the amount of heat that was generated when it was used on wounds. 5 studies were conducted that all found an average temperature between 40 and 50 degrees Celsius, or 104 to 102 degrees freedom units, which is like hot tap water. However, the study that was conducted by the army doctors, including John Holcomb, found temperatures twice as high. How could that even be possible if they are conducting their studies in the same way? Well, that's the secret. The army wasn't. Rather than using Quikclot on arterial bleeds, the army was placing it on organ injuries and recorded temperatures hot enough to boil water. In another study, they mixed blood with water and then added an extremely high ratio of Quikclot to liquid and recorded the temperature while mixing the solution, which is the kind of bullshit study that has no real-world application, and the doctors probably got paid millions of dollars in taxpayer money, and they used it to build their credibility as doctors, even though it's total bullshit. So not only is the army not using real-world application, they are potentially just outright lying about the results because the doctors who did the original blood clotting trial that started this whole thing did a similar study and found temperatures 25 degrees Celsius cooler. This just doesn't make sense. Regardless, the army ran with it and published their study alongside an article from a doctor who was not a trauma doctor or a hematologist that stated using Quikclot was equal to the medieval practice of using scalding oil to cauterize wounds. This was horrible publicity for Bart and Frank, and because it was so sensationalized, it covered up a study of actual battlefield use of Quikclot that showed in 103 uses of Quikclot on actual traumatic injuries, only one caused burns to a degree that required additional care. At this point, it seems obvious to everyone supporting Quikclot that the army is going to do everything, including skewing data and basically lying, to avoid using it. John Holcomb was so adamantly against Quikclot that he would often go to these medical trade shows and take a styrofoam cup of water and pour Quikclot into it until it melted, at which point he would tell everyone in attendance, "I don't think we want that on our soldiers." These displays from Holcomb made Bart furious, especially as more and more battlefield data came in support of Quikclot, and more army soldiers were being killed when Quikclot could have saved them. But it was during this time that Holcomb and his band of army doctors were pushing article after article bashing Quikclot to research communities that Bart and Coakley learned something crucial. While Holcomb and doctors high in army ranks hated Quikclot, army medics on the ground were doing everything possible to get their hands on it. This is where Bart learned a critical factor in business. You have to sell to the right customer. See, while Bart was busy chasing the approval of doctors that weren't actively in combat, he was ignoring the people who actually wanted and needed the product. Army medics were desperately reaching out to Joe DeCorda, trying to get shipments sent to them from the Navy. And those who were using it in the field eventually took their stories to the press, and articles started coming out about how effective Quikclot actually is. And Frank even received some validation when he was named one of the top 50 inventors in Scientific American for inventing Quikclot. This is all really good news, and after Bart starts marketing the product to the medics on the ground, he receives massive orders from individual army battalions who are authorized to make purchases that are deemed mission critical, even though using Quikclot is still against army protocol. These orders give Bart hope, but he still feels that the army is denying soldiers the care they desperately need, and one day in late 2005, he's had enough and calls Holcomb's office directly. Their conversation is brief, with Bart asking Holcomb if they could join forces and get Quikclot out to soldiers and maybe even work together on improving it. Holcomb responds with very few, extremely sarcastic words, ending with, "Oh yes, let's get right on that," and then hanging up the phone. Bart wouldn't learn this until later, but at this point, Holcomb had moved on from Quikclot and Hemcon. In fact, he had moved on from outside intervention entirely and was pushing for a blood clotting drug that would be injected directly into the bloodstream, a drug called Factor VII. Up to this point in time, everyone had been working on external bandages that were applied topically to a wound, but this new drug, Factor VII, promised the ability to turn the natural clotting process on and off from the inside like a light switch. Think of it like anesthesia, where pain receptors are turned off or on at will with the use of a drug, only for the clotting system. This could mean, in theory, that medics in the field could stop bleeding from multiple wound sites with a single injection. No more gauze, no more bandages, just a syringe of this miracle drug. The way Factor VII did this was by filling the blood with the seventh factor in the clotting process to the point that the body could skip the next two steps in the process, causing rapid clotting. And if you remember from when Bart and Frank were working on getting their FDA approval, getting drugs on the market takes a lot longer than medical devices like Hemcon and Quikclot. And Factor VII had actually been in the works for nearly 2 decades before John Holcomb started championing it to stop traumatic bleeding. It was originally created as a cure for people with hemophilia, a rare condition in which the body doesn't produce the 8th clotting factor, causing people to often bleed to death from the most basic of injuries or surgeries like a tooth extraction. Because Factor VII could jumpstart the clotting process and skip the need for the 8th factor, it became a miracle drug for the few people who suffered from hemophilia. Eventually, the drug was discovered by the Israeli military as a potential drug for stopping traumatic bleeding, which is how it came to Holcomb's attention at a medical conference. Holcomb is so enthralled with the idea of Factor VII that he personally starts overseeing its injection into patients that were wounded in Iraq. One such patient is a young soldier by the name of Caleb Lufkin. Lufkin, an army private from Knoxville, Illinois, was riding in an armored truck through Baghdad working on clearing roadside bombs. While driving through the streets of the city, one of the hidden bombs detonated under his truck. Two of his fellow soldiers were killed instantly, and Lufkin only manages to escape when a medic pulled him from the mangled gunner's hatch. As the truck became engulfed in flames, the medic applied tourniquets and bandage to Lufkin's arms and legs and called for a helicopter, which takes him to the 10th Combat Support Hospital in Baghdad. Upon arriving, doctors and surgeons promised him they wouldn't let him die before sedating him, giving him a breathing tube, and under the direct supervision of Holcomb himself, inject him with Factor 7. During the surgery, which Holcomb assists in conducting, the surgeons are amazed that the bleeding goes from aggressive and hard to control to almost non-existent. This was amazing news and served as good enough evidence for Holcomb to begin pushing the drug into the hands of doctors across the army for use in trauma patients. However, there was a problem. 3 weeks later, May 25th, 2006, Caleb Lufkin died of a heart attack caused by a clot in his heart during another surgery. He was buried in Knoxville, Illinois, and only a few weeks later did his father learn that Caleb had been injected with Factor 7. The Army never disclosed to the family that Caleb was given it. They only found out thanks to a news article. And Caleb's story would only be an unfortunate outlier if he was the only soldier to die from a heart attack thanks to Factor 7. But he wasn't. Several months before Caleb Lufkin was injected, the Israeli military had actually pulled it from use for traumatic bleeding due to the reports of heart attacks and strokes in their soldiers. In fact, the number of these reports was so high that clinical trials were conducted and found that 7% of patients injected with Factor 7 to stop bleeding suffered from heart attacks or strokes, which I know doesn't seem that high, but when you compare it to 2% of people who suffered these side effects when not treated with it, it becomes worrisome. And the fact that many of the people that are having these reported heart attacks and strokes are in their 20s and 30s, it's even worse. But it's like we talked about earlier. In trauma care, you have to take risks and push for things that might be untested in order to save lives, right? How were John Holcomb and the Army supposed to know that this was going to happen ahead of time? Because they already knew about it. Yeah, in early 2001, before Quikclot, before HemCon, hell, before 9/11, John Holcomb and other trauma doctors from around the country met to try and stage a large-scale clinical trial of Factor 7 for treating traumatic bleeding. The FDA looked at their proposal and said no because there wasn't enough evidence that Factor 7 would be safe for human testing for that purpose. In fact, the FDA blocked all testing of the drug in the United States because it was shown to be too unsafe. Which is a wild thing to read at this point in time because nowadays almost everything the FDA does is called into question thanks to 2020. Anyway, you're probably hearing all of this and thinking, okay, that should be the end of it, right? I mean, the FDA, who had to approve Quikclot and HemCon and every other drug the military uses said no, we can just move on, right? Well, that's what I thought too, but the people campaigning for this drug wouldn't take no for an answer, so a doctor in South Africa decided he would conduct his own trial, and what he discovered and what he published are two different things. Very, very basic summary of the findings was that Factor 7 resulted in fewer patients needing blood transfusions than the control, and equal numbers of thromboembolic events. In other words, it works to clot blood better than the other stuff, and the number of strokes and heart attacks are about the same. However, the study removed the patients that had died within 48 hours of being treated, and when you put those back into the study, there was almost no difference between those who were treated with Factor 7 and those who weren't. For this reason, criticism of the study was immediate and fairly widespread, but it didn't really matter to Holcomb and the Army. They had a positive study to justify Factor 7's use, and that's all they needed. And you might be thinking, okay, but they still don't have FDA approval to use it. But there's something you need to know about Army medicine and off-label drug use. Off-label drug use is just a fancy way of saying a medication being used for something that isn't its primary use. One of the most famous examples is Viagra, which was originally a blood pressure medication that had the side effects of giving you a pants salute. This eventually became the main use of the drug because boners are way more fun than good blood pressure. And this kind of thing happens way more frequently than you would think and can drastically change the reason that drugs are used. So when you pair the common practice of off-label use with the fact that John Holcomb basically acts like a commander more than a doctor. At a regular hospital, you have someone in charge of research, someone in charge of writing policy, and someone in charge of evaluating adherence to those policies who are all different people or even a board. At the Army Institute of Surgical Research, that person is one man, the commander of the entire institute, who is basically able to push the institute in whatever direction he thinks is best, adopting whatever drugs and using whatever studies to justify it and push it out to the entire army. And that's John Holcomb. This means that John Holcomb, if able to justify the use of a drug with just one study, can make decisions for how the entire army is directed to treat patients. And in early 2004, Factor VII became the drug that Army medicine pushed into every combat hospital, and according to some reports, into the veins of any soldier with signs of serious bleeding. And upon hearing this, Bart and Frank become convinced that John Holcomb has a vendetta against them personally and will do anything not to adopt Quikclot, even harming soldiers. And they weren't the only ones. Almost immediately after the Army adopted Factor VII, many in the trauma field, other branches of the military, and even doctors in the Army started pushing back. As it became more prominent in treating wounded soldiers, more and more doctors came out with stories about patients having blood clots where they shouldn't: the lungs, brain, and heart. And one doctor came out because he believed that it may be due to the increase in injuries from IEDs. Most people think that when a bomb goes off, the injury occurs from shrapnel, the metal and debris that is thrown from the bomb. And while that is certainly true, the blast wave or sudden change in pressure from the explosion is also a huge factor. This doctor hypothesized that part of the reason for these strokes and heart attacks was that these shock waves cause tiny little tears inside blood vessels and arteries throughout the body. The body could repair these themselves, but injecting Factor VII causes bigger clots than the injury needed. So, with all this evidence and data coming in, is Holcomb finally going to change his mind and take Factor VII out of use? Nope. In fact, Holcomb argued that even though there was no evidence for decreased mortality in those injected with Factor VII, it still needed to be used because of the severity of the injuries that soldiers were facing, including IEDs, and that desperate times call for desperate measures. Which, from the standpoint of a civilian who doesn't know much about medicine or war, that makes sense. You have to do whatever you can to save our soldiers, and doing clinical trials in the middle of a war just doesn't make sense. But from the standpoint of many in the medical field, this was a dangerous game, no matter what good intentions or motives you might have. Insert something about a road paved with good intentions and whatever destination it leads to. So Bart and Frank continue to fight for Quikclot's use, and Holcomb continues to push Factor VII into the arms of Army soldiers even after several years of data piling up and Israeli and British Army medics pulling it from use. And remember earlier when I said that the Army has a lot of influence on other branches and even the civilian world? Well, at this point in time, many in the civilian side of trauma medicine saw the Army using Factor VII and decided to start using it themselves. This caused the sale of this drug to skyrocket past $1 billion a year, and to the point that hemophilia patients, the ones the drug was actually supposed to be used on, only accounted for 3% of its use. This huge increase in sales will be an important factor later, but all of this eventually brings us back to 2006 and Caleb Lufkin's injection with Factor VII. After all the years of data, warnings, and pushback from doctors, and Bart and Frank pushing Quikclot as hard as possible, it was Caleb Lufkin's death that would finally wake the Army up. In December 2006, an article was published in the Baltimore Sun on the death of Caleb Lufkin and another soldier who had been injected with Factor VII. The article also went into detail on the fight between Hemcon and Quikclot and the military's race to stop bleeding. This was the first real publicity that the battle between the two bandages had, but it was overshadowed by the piece on Lufkin's death, which attracted the most attention and led to many calling for an investigation into Factor VII and its use on Army soldiers. A week later, Barbers Mikulski, the Democratic senator from Illinois, wrote a letter to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs to review the use of Factor VII and if the long-term dangers outweigh the immediate benefits. John Holcomb was eventually called to testify in front of Congress on why the Army had used Factor VII in the first place, stating that he believed that the benefits outweighed the risks and that the FDA has no place on the battlefield. Congress's findings and response to the letters and Holcomb's testimony are not available to the public, and nothing was published from the Army that explicitly changed policy. However, after his appearance before Congress, the Army's use of Factor 7 drastically decreased, as did its use on the civilian side. And at the same time that Factor 7 was falling out of favor with the Army, so apparently was John Holcomb. There was a growing number of complaints against Holcomb within the Institute of Surgical Research on how Holcomb conducted himself as a leader, and several that cited he pushed HemCon in spite of the fact that unpublished studies showed it didn't work any better than regular gauze. An investigation was launched that eventually cleared Holcomb and the ISR of any wrongdoing. Shocker. Yeah, we investigated ourselves and we found that we did nothing wrong. Anyway, Holcomb eventually resigned his position at the ISR and then left the Army altogether and immediately became a professor of medical surgery in Austin, Texas. But the trouble for Holcomb didn't stop there. One of the people who worked under him, an anesthesiologist named Ian Black, filed a complaint with the Army Inspector General on the use of Factor 7, and shortly after filed a whistleblower lawsuit against Novo Nordisk, the company that manufactured it. This began a 3-year legal battle that heavily implicated the ISR and John Holcomb. Black's lawsuit alleged that himself and other doctors were pressured by Novo Nordisk to use Factor 7, that kickbacks from the company to doctors had occurred, and that they had engaged in illegal marketing tactics and defrauded the federal government. The law that they had based this suit on was one passed during the Civil War when contractors had intentionally sold sick horses, bad ammunition, and spoiled rations to the Army. The suit was eventually picked up by the Department of Justice, which was a big deal because the government doesn't really back cases unless they're pretty certain that they can win. The suit alleged that Novo Nordisk had set up a foundation called the True Foundation in order to funnel money from the drug company to doctors that promoted the use of Factor 7 by paying for travel, medical conferences, speaker engagement fees, and even gifts like laptops and other research equipment. Novo Nordisk denied any wrongdoing, but after a 3-year investigation, paid $25 million and entered a corporate integrity agreement with the United States Department of Health, which stated they would cease their aggressive marketing tactics. This made it one of the largest medical malpractice lawsuits in military history, but only time will tell if Novo Nordisk actually sticks to it, as they are still pretty heavily involved in US military medicine. But before the suit was resolved, in fact before it was even known to anyone in Z-Medica, all the years of fighting the Army to adopt Quikclot and watching them use an unproven and dangerous drug finally starts to weigh on Bart, and one day, he cracks. Suddenly his productivity and mood shift, and he becomes volatile at work, often throwing things around his office and screaming at employees over minor mistakes. And he was constantly wondering, how could it be that the Army was allowed to push this dangerous, unproven, and expensive drug when he and Frank had the solution and even spent the last several years trying to convince them? The lack of an answer to this question, paired with some internal issues between him and Frank, as well as some hidden trauma from time spent on contracting trips with the military, they wore him down. Eventually, Frank calls Bart into a meeting and tells him that he needs to take a break in order to work on his personal issues and his marriage, and Frank doesn't really give Bart a choice. This is an order. Bart moves his family to Florida and starts living the lifestyle that comes with it. Golfing, fishing, days on the beach, and sailing, but none of it really works. All these things that he had loved, especially sailing, couldn't fix what was wrong, and his life just continues to spiral out of control. One day, while sitting on the couch, he has a full-on PTSD attack. The trauma of the things he'd seen in Iraq, the anger and hate he'd received from his father growing up, and his continued battle with Holcomb all crash together. He starts spending every waking moment distracting himself with television, the activities he loved but aren't working, and booze. He finally starts to see a counselor that gives him the official diagnosis of PTSD, and he starts working on uncovering a way forward, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to save his marriage. He separates from his wife and moves into an RV, and it's sort of a final defeat for him. A man who had gone from a salesman with nothing to sell to running 2 companies that made him a millionaire was now back where he started, only now he was alone. In the fall of 2008, Bart was stopped at a stoplight in his new car with a license plate that said Quikclot. He was in the middle of fighting another heavy bout of depression, and as he sat at the light feeling empty, angry, and numb, a truck pulled up next to him. The driver of his truck rolled down his window and shouted at Bart, "Did you have anything to do with Quikclot?" "Yeah, I helped invent it. That stuff saved my son's life in Iraq. God bless you." Before Bart could reply, the light turned green and the truck drove off, the driver giving him a thumbs up as he sped away. It's at this point that Bart just can't stay in Florida. He's lonely, depressed, and nothing he does seems to help. He had also learned that in his absence, both companies, On-Site Gas and Z-Medica, had kind of stagnated. This was all the motivation he needed to move back to Connecticut, so he sets up a meeting with Frank and they agree that Bart will slowly start making his way back into the everyday work of the companies. Upon his return, Bart learns that Frank has actually been working on a new formula for Quikclot, one that doesn't include zeolite and could be put into a bandage rather than a packet of loose mineral. And in his ever unassuming and non-flamboyant way, Frank discovered a cheap mineral called kaolin that clotted blood just as effectively as zeolite, but without releasing any heat. And this was the improvement they had been looking for, the thing that the Army always cited as the reason they never adopted Quikclot. The release of heat was about to be a thing of the past. After some prototyping, they create a 12-foot long gauze strip that they fill with kaolin and fit in a single package, and they ship it off for testing in the Special Forces community, and the results are promising. After this, the Navy and Marine Corps give Z-Medica $3 million to conduct actual clinical human tests, and the results are astonishing. Not only did the new bandage work just as well as the zeolite powder, but no heat was released. And because it's already packaged in gauze, it serves as a sort of two-in-one product. And Bart jumps right in as the team is finishing developing this new product, and as always the salesman, he helps name it. Frank and the team had already come up with combat gauze, but Bart insisted that they put Quikclot in the name, giving the new product the reliable credibility that Quikclot had already built. This new version entirely replaces the original Quikclot formula, and shortly after its introduction is selected by the entire military, with the Army leading the charge as the bandage of choice for all personnel. And it was actually John Holcomb, as one of his last acts as the director of the ISR, that made the recommendation. Finally, after years of trying to get Holcomb and the Army to accept their invention, Bart and Frank finally got through to them. They had won. They beat every company and product the Army tried to stop them with. But more importantly to them, Army soldiers would now have a product that they could depend on to save lives. Bart and Frank celebrated, and orders of combat gauze exploded. Z-Medica had to grow in order to meet the demand of nearly 3.5 million bandages in the first year. But even all that success was slightly undermined by a single article. In September 2009, the Army released an article claiming that they had invented combat gauze. The article was focused on the best inventions of 2008 fielded by the Army, and combat gauze was listed, with the developer being the United States Army Institute of Surgical Research. No mention of Z-Medica, Bart, or Frank. It's just like the old saying, if you can't beat them, claim their success as your own and take all the credit. And this royally pisses off everyone at Z-Medica, including Frank, who normally didn't show much emotion, and even Eagles and DeCorda, who demanded a retraction. Uncharacteristically, the only one that didn't seem angry was Bart. After the article was published, he came into Frank's office shouting, not with anger, but excitement. He tells Frank that this meant they won. Since the Army took credit for the invention, it means that the fight between them is over. The Army can claim the invention all they want, but everyone at Z-Medica knows the truth. And as long as the bandages were getting to soldiers who needed them, to Bart it didn't really matter. And the wins for Bart and Frank keep coming. Shortly after this article, they learned of Holcomb's resignation and leaving the Army. The man who had stood in their way and fought so hard to keep them from achieving their goal was gone, and they were left standing with the product that worked and the Army on their side. But John Holcomb still had plenty of wins on his side, awards and articles detailing his work in the Army and claiming that he had done more than anyone else to save lives through his work in combat care, which is a bit of a complicated acolyte to give him. All the devices he backed, Fibrin, Hemcon, and Factor 7 had failed and even led to unnecessary death. But at the same time, Holcomb advocated for tourniquets in every soldier's pack and even brought whole blood transfusions back into common practice, something that combat medics had moved away from thanks to the ability to separate different parts of blood. His bringing the whole blood practice back and advocating for tourniquets likely did a lot to save lives of unknowable numbers of people, which makes his story a pretty complicated one. His desire to save soldiers was born out of his role as the doctor in the deadliest battle America had seen since Vietnam. Fueled by this experience, along with his attitude of testing unproven methods if they can save lives, and the army attitudes of only wanting products that they invented, it makes sense why he took some of the actions he did, even if they ultimately led to unnecessary deaths. And I don't really know what to make of him. On one hand, I completely agree that we shouldn't carelessly use products that we don't know the side effects of on soldiers and taking unnecessary risks. But on the other hand, the motivation of not wanting soldiers to die on your watch when there's something, if even unproven or dangerous, that you can do about it. The book I used to research for this video tends to paint Holcomb as a villain, and I don't think that's entirely fair. I think this story is a cautionary tale about the danger of blinding ambition and the inability to humble yourself when someone else solves the problem that you're trying to solve. Much of the needless injury and death the soldiers faced on the operating table could have been avoided if Holcomb and his team had put their pride away and recognized that somebody else had done it better than them. And that's a hard thing to do. I also think it's one of the best examples of that classic phrase brought to life: the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I believe John Holcomb wanted to, and likely still wants to, save lives. I just hope that this experience with Quikclot humbled him to see that maybe he doesn't have to be the one developing the solution, maybe he's just someone who uses it. Unfortunately, the system that had impacted Holcomb's pushing for Factor 7 and led to the Novo Nordisk paying out their $25 million settlement hasn't really changed. The off-label prescribing of medications continues to this day and is just as aggressive as it was back then, despite calls for Congress to enact stricter guidelines to off-label use of drugs. But I'm sure Novo Nordisk has learned their lesson and no longer pushes for off-label use of drugs in order to increase sales and make more money. Oh, never mind. I'm sure that off-label use won't have any disastrous consequences for our health or culture. Tim Coakley, whose real-world experience with Quikclot and testimonials helped it become the success it eventually was, became one of the leaders in Navy medicine at the Navy Expeditionary Combat Command in Virginia. He eventually was able to somewhat recover from the effects of his PTSD, and even played a role in developing a large number of the practices still used to treat PTSD today. Although retired, he still spends time creating patents for medical developments and supporting his growing family. Tom Eagles, the man who did everything in his career for The Kid in the Ditch, died on June 3, 2016 from complications of injuries and exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam, and is still one of the most decorated medics in American history. But what about Bart and Frank, the men behind this medical miracle? Well, they continued to push combat gauze out to the United States military as well as law enforcement agencies, and were eventually approached by multiple private equity firms about selling Z-Medica. After finding the firm and negotiating that the offices stay in Connecticut and all the employees remain employed, Bart and Frank sold Z-Medica in early 2012 and each received checks in excess of $12 million, with even larger payouts later in 2016. Bart retired and bought a property in Connecticut as well as one in Florida, and continues to spend time with his family and friends, as well as donates money to rowing teams in high schools and colleges, as well as those around the world impacted by natural disasters. Frank has never had his name mentioned in any other publication other than the mention in Scientific American from 2003 for the original Quikclot formula. He and his wife took their fortune from Quikclot and became Connecticut real estate investors, but continue to live quiet and unassuming lives. Z-Medica was eventually resold again to another medical product company for nearly $500 million. The reason for such a huge sale was the fact that combat gauze had finally made it into the hospital market and was being used by physicians and hospitals to treat traumatic bleeding. Combat gauze even made the news thanks to Taylor Swift when she said in an interview that her team carries it due to security worries at her concert. But there's one story that wraps up everything we've talked about more than any other. On January 30th, 2010, a 26-year-old policeman in a New Jersey town just 20 miles from where Jamie Smith grew up pulled into a parking lot a few blocks from his police station. A black car that had been following him for several miles pulled in next to him. The officer rolled down his window and identified himself before the driver of the other vehicle pulled out a gun and shot the officer in the face before exiting his vehicle and shooting the officer 7 more times before driving away. The officer, who now had a broken jaw, collapsed lung, and 3 bullets in his legs, crawled to the roadway where a passerby called for help. Once officers arrived, they began bandaging his face, but the officer told them to work on his legs because he knew he had been hit in his femoral artery. One of the officers pulled out Quikclot combat gauze and applied it to the wound before the officer was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent 12 hours of surgery but ultimately survived. That officer's name was Gerald Veneciano, now a construction foreman and father of 2, who owes his life to the Quikclot that was invented because of Jamie Smith and the very same injury he suffered. Had it not been for Bart and Frank's desire to create their product after seeing Jamie Smith's death in Black Hawk Down, Gerald Veneciano and countless others probably wouldn't have survived. And I can't think of a more perfect ending to the story of Quikclot, the medical miracle invented by the 2 most unlikely people that completely changed the way medics around the world treat traumatic bleeding. And like I mentioned in the opening, if you don't have some, you should probably get some. Thank you all for watching. The end.